Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Birch and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by Speedway Properties. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. The membership is also available online at preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster County in the 1870s. Jim has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J&L Lee Company, a publisher of regional books as well as the Coinery. Jim has written over 1,000 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. Jim is on the Nebraska State Historical Society Board of Trustees and also serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission. He is also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is a series of talks titled Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln, and this is program number 21. Jim invites you to ask questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
I still approve. Okay. The two buildings which we see are on the southeast corner of 12th and O Streets. Both are gone, sort of. The building on the corner, of course, is going to become McGee's. We'll see in this picture it is Rector's Pharmacy. The building to the left is Costco Pharmacy. And about the only thing we have left of those buildings is occasionally in a flea market or an antique show, a mall or someplace, we'll see an impressed glass bottle from one of those. But the building on the left, in a way, is kind of interesting because, to the best of my knowledge, it is still there. The upper floor may be removed, I'm not certain, but behind it goes the walkway, downtown Skywalk. And as it cuts through McGee's, they cut through a very old building, and we think the building on the left, which has been any number of things through the years, I think its last habitable occupant was a shoe store, but I'm not absolutely certain. But I think that building still may stand. We're talking about McGee's, however, right now. McGee's itself started with a man by the name of John McGee, who settled near Valparaiso, Nebraska in 1868. He then established a company called McGee & Sons with his son Oliver, a McGee whose name lives on in Nebraska Westland, certainly. That was in 1881, and the store was at that point in Valparaiso. Then son Oliver and his wife, Nellie, moved to Seneca, Kansas in 1895, but returned to Lincoln in 1902, where he, Oliver McGee, worked for the Globe clothing company at 1009 O Streets, and then opened a new store called McGee and Deemer, which is another name you'll run across in antique stores, usually as fans or something, maybe rulers, something like that. McGee and Deemer was at 1109 O Street, so both on the north side of O Street. In 1918, the building we see here, Rector Pharmacy on the corner, was purchased by Oliver McGee and then torn down, and of course in the process of this that we see here, and is replaced with the McGee's building that we see today standing on the same corner. The building finished almost within a year of their tearing it down in 1918. Unfortunately, during the building of the building, Mr. McGee passed away. We're not completely clear on why he passed away. Some reports have him dying in the influenza epidemic of 1918. Others say he died of a ruptured appendix, but nonetheless, the end result was the same, and he was gone. Late in the spring of that year, the president of the corporation became Nellie McGee. So she literally took over the time this building was built. We think, but do not know, that the building was destined to have more stories, one or two more than it has in this picture. Later on, one of the Smiths, I think Craig, will build a penthouse on top of the building, and that still stands. So the house is still up there that he built and occupied for a short time, and in fact it's used for parties occasionally by Speedway Properties or by Mr. Smith. At any rate, after Nellie operated the store very successfully for a good long time, in 1939 she turned it over to her sons, one of whom is Bob McGee, who we still know today. In 1968, McGee's had expanded to the point where they had stores at Omaha and the Crossroads, Gateway Shopping Center in Lincoln, one in Aurora, Colorado, and one in Sterling, Colorado. All of the McGee's stores are now, of course, gone. So we can see the building as it was completed. Moving up a little bit and over to P Street is the Orpheum Theater, which originally in its name, the Orpheum, stood at 1500 O Street. A lot of theaters on O Street at 1500 O Street, or on that corner of 15th and O now, Centennial Mall and O Street. One of the theater buildings still stands. That's the Husker Building, which is on the northwest corner of the intersection. It has a restaurant in it and a bar. I mean, what on O Street doesn't have a bar or a restaurant in it at this point in time? Before that, it was a paint store. Before that, it was the theater building, Husker Theater, Colonial Theater, all around in that same area. But the Orpheum was a 1500, which would put it on the northeast corner of the intersection. 1913, it reopened as the Orpheum on 12th and P. This would be the northwest corner of that intersection, and it was vaudeville and photoplay, one word, P-H-O-T-O-P-L-E. I'm not sure what that is, but I'm pretty sure it was some sort of an origin of the motion picture. They had stage conveniences they advertised for monkeys, dogs, horses, and elephants, with dressing rooms in the basement. And they also had in the basement a bear pit, which was also available to the people who used the Varsity or the Orpheum, the Varsity or the Lansing Theater at 13th and P Streets. In 1941, it co-hosted the world's premiere for Cheers for Miss Bishop, which we will see a little bit about in a minute, not very much. 1972, 1973, the building was raised and a new three-story building went in its place, which was originally the Cooper Theater's Cinema 1 and 2, then became the Douglas 4. Now it is owned by the Arbor Day Foundation, and they have the upper floors, and the lower floor has a Panera Bread, and I think there's another restaurant in there that operates out of the same area. The building itself I enjoyed, but I, interestingly enough, watched it being torn down, and I went over to the Ram Park, which is catty corner to the southeast from this building. During my noon hour, I'd walk by, going over to Miller and Payne's Tea Room, I'd walk by and watch this building being torn down. Usually I walked up to the top floor, and I always had my camera with me, except one day when I got up on the top floor and looked, the building itself was all gone. The auditorium is behind these parts, and you can see doctors' offices and other offices around on the second floor surrounding the auditorium, and then also retail businesses on the ground floor, including Mulzer Music, the Glass House Antiques, Eno Insurance Agency, and so forth are on the ground floor. But the fateful day I was up there in '73, I looked across, and all the main part of the building was gone. You could see part of the basement, but they had left the fly clear on the north or the alley end of the building. So the fly was there. That meant the stage was there. And they were, at that point, going towards the north and tearing it down, and they had a big ball swinging against the brickwork. And as it did, there was a tremendous thump. And from the top of the fly came down a huge curtain. So whoomp, like that. And it was a oak leaf around the letter O, the Orpheum Theater. So there it was, a ruined building, nothing but shambles and dust, and that curtain. And of course, that was the day I didn't have my camera. It would have been a great picture. Still stands today as the Arbor Day. The building is completely gone. Interior to the building, we can see the south end of the portion of the building just outside the auditorium. The auditorium would have been to the right or to the north in this picture. And this is looking at the stage. We're looking towards the west in this picture. It's a very large auditorium. The only thing I remember seeing in there other than motion pictures was P.D.Q. Bach, the guy from Hoople, North Dakota, came and brought a full orchestra, and they were on stage. And in order to get to the stage, P.D.Q. Bach came on a cable from up in the balcony and rode it down to the stage, and on the stage was a full orchestra, including a harpist who was wearing a long black dress. She came on with the orchestra, sat down in the front, took out a cigar, lit it, and smoked it during the entire performance, and never once played the harp. Memorable. It had nothing to do with the theater. In its later years, this is what the theater looked like, and this is when it was called the Nebraska Theater, which came on a little bit later. Cheers for Miss Bishop, as I mentioned, was previewed in the building, written by Bess Reader Aldrich, and she optioned it. As soon as she wrote it, she optioned the screenplay to MGM for 2 months, but they made no action on the option whatsoever. So Bess Reader Aldrich picked up and moved to Hollywood, where she was hired by Paramount as a writer and to write the script for Cheers for Miss Bishop. In 1939, she'd almost given up. She sold the rights to the picture to Paramount for $15,000. Ultimately, they did produce the film. The plot itself was a story loosely based on the life of Louise Pound, a professor of English at the University of Nebraska. And the film, which was set at Midwestern University, was filmed in the city of Lincoln. They hired hundreds of extras. 600 students were hired, for example, from $2 to $10 a day to be extras in the film. They paid out a total of $2,000 for extras, so no expense was spared. Then on January the 15th of 1941, all of the stars came in on trains, special trains, had a reception, a tea, and a dinner. Then the Stewart Theater was primarily where the world's premiere was, but the overflow went into the Nebraska Theater. 95-minute black and white film. Some people have compared it to Goodbye, Mr. Chips. However, this was actually precedent to it and written before it. Next picture is Gooch's Mill, started by a man by the name of Herbert Elmer Gooch, a tremendous obstacle to his youth, I'm sure. He was born in Duluth, raised there, and became a miller in Duluth. Then in 1905, he began building the sprawling complex, which we know today at roughly 6th and South Street. Runs roughly from 5th to 6th and South. By 1908, he had 10 employees in the building and was refining 32 tons of flour per day, so not a small amount at all. In 1910, he purchased the Star newspaper. The Star had been started in 1902 by Mr. Thompson, and when he started it, it was a Republican newspaper designed 100% to promote the presidency of Mr. Roosevelt. The first Roosevelt was a Republican, and the second one was a Democrat. So he started the paper in 1902 to promote Mr. Roosevelt's presidency. It worked, and after the election, he was ultimately appointed ambassador to Brazil. He left the state of Nebraska, selling his house to the state of Nebraska to become the first governor's mansion, true one. And then when Mr. Gooch bought it, he bought it primarily to change it to a Democrat newspaper. And there used to be a lot of that, but not so much anymore. He also had a very large interest in Lincoln Mills. And Lincoln Mills, I remember as a kid, was still located at about 9th and Vine Streets. I don't know whether they were doing any milling or not. Would have been directly across the street, literally from the football stadium. The offices for all of the mills were in the fraternity building, which I think we'll see yet today is today where the Sharp building stands. 1917, Mr. Gooch installed the largest electric oven in the world in this building. And then by 1923, in the oven, he was producing 50,000 loaves of bread a day, using 2,000 pounds of flour. His signature or advertising nickname was "Often Buttered, Never Bettered," Gooch's bread. 1929, of course, the Great Depression came along, and in a cash crimp, they said, he was running low on a lot of money in a lot of his enterprises. He sold the newspaper at that point in time for $1 million to Lee Enterprises in Iowa. And Lee Enterprises, of course, now not only owns the Star, but also has purchased the Journal. So it's the Lincoln Journal Star, or the Star Journal, Journal Star. And it depends or not whether it has a hyphen in it or not. If it has the hyphen in it, it's the printing company. If it doesn't, I believe it's the newspaper, the Journal Star. 1938, Mr. Gooch died under mysterious circumstances. We think it was probably a suicide. In fact, it almost had to have been. The elevator was then sold to a group of owners in Salina, Kansas, headed by a man by the name of J.J. Vanier, V-A-N-I-E-R. By 1954, it had come up and had gone down, but at that point, it still had 420 employees. 1960, They were unloading 50 railroad cars a day and 40 truckloads of grain per week for the mill's use. 1970 was bought by Archer Daniels Midlands, and now is one of the 10 flowering mills left in Nebraska. It may not even be quite that many. At one time, there were over 300 mills in the state of Nebraska. A few of them operated by water, most of them by steam. What's going on out there exactly right now, I'm not sure. There's still a presence. It's still operating, but certainly not hundreds of employees anymore. There will be a few cars in the parking lots. Occasionally there will be a grain car unloading. But exactly what's going on, I'm not sure. The Humane Society fountain, or the Lincoln Humane Society fountain, was installed after their initial incorporation in 1907. The fountain was located dead in the middle of M Street between 8th and 9th in front of the building we now know as the Color Court. It was right in the middle of the intersection, as we can see it here. Had a lower portion where dogs could drink, and an upper portion you can see where horses would drink. And also the gentleman with the tin cup was drinking with the horses, apparently. Behind him, the Color Court building is still standing, so we're probably looking in this picture towards the east. It was one of two fountains in Lincoln which were removed as traffic obstacles. Both of them, the same gentleman had a driving problem. It wasn't that he had trouble driving. He did very well driving, but he liked also, as a supplement to his driving, he liked to tipple. And he continually ran into the two fountains. The other one was the Thompson Fountain, which is in the middle of J Street. This one was removed. The Thompson Fountain was removed. Thompson Fountain ended up out in Antelope Park, and right now will be reconfigured, at least the base of it, probably into they'll call it a fountain, but it looks like right now it'll be a planter on the west side in front of the old Folsom Zoo building. So that has been moved around several times. This fountain, when it was removed, sat briefly also in the Children's Zoo, and to the best of my knowledge, this is the one now that stands down in the Haymarket by the water tank, kind of over there on the north end of the depot. So it lives on as well. House, which is still standing, of course, is the house belonging to the Fergusons. This is the Ferguson Mansion. William Ferguson came to Nebraska in 1879. He came in a covered wagon and did not come to Lincoln. He came to Hastings, Nebraska, then moved to Lincoln in 1903. He was president of the Beatrice Creamery. Of course, that we know a lot about that. We'll talk about it if we haven't already. We'll talk about that later. He also owned the Woodlawn Dairy. The Woodlawn Dairy, some of the barns are still out there, clear to the north end off of the runways and on the highway towards Seward. Woodlawn Dairy, I think the barn that is left is now used as a Halloween venue where they sell pumpkins, and they used to have a corn maze and stuff. But what's left of that operation, I don't know. But that's all that's left of the Woodlawn Dairy, which was owned by Mr. Ferguson along with the Beatrice Creamery. He also owned a little company called the Lincoln Traction Company, which operated the street railway system in Lincoln. He also owned Yankee Hill Brickyard. In addition to that, he was a school board member who was one of the people instrumental in building Lincoln High School where it sits today. And he also owned an amusement park called Capitol Beach. So anybody who's old enough has had a lot of sort of rub-alongs with Mr. Ferguson. The building is built primarily not of Yankee Hill brick, however. It's built of Milwaukee cold press brick, which Yankee Hill didn't build that fine a brick. And the way I can see the difference primarily between a cold press brick and, say, a Yankee Hill brick is the cold press brick is very, very perfectly flat on all sides, just like a sheet of paper. The Yankee Hill brick has undulations and is kind of, if you will, kind of crude. So that when you build a building of Yankee Hill brick, and I'm looking at our architectural forum over here, so that if I step off the middle line, you will correct me. But you are able to use, if you use a very, very flat brick, you're able to use a much smaller course between them. So if you look at a wall built of cold press brick, it has very, very small courses of concrete and cement between them. However, if you go to the building behind it, the carriage house behind the Ferguson House, you'll see it does have of course, between it's very large. So we think that is probably his own brick. It's interesting he didn't think enough of his brick to use it. It was built from 1909 through 1911. So it took over 2 years, literally, to build this house. And part of the reason for that was the architect. Okay. The architect was from Cleveland, and probably he specified, I think it's still feeding back, and he probably specified that brick. The Olson Construction Company in Lincoln built it. But the reason it took so long partially was the architect insisted that after the basement level was done, that it winter 1 year before they added the next floor on, and then that wintered 1 year before they put the top on, so that all the settling was done. It was the first home or house supposedly built west of the Missouri River to use steel beams, called Renaissance Revival architecture. Made interior, there's a lot of Vermont marble used, Cuban mahogany around, and you go in today and you can turn to the right and go into what was the dining room. Cuban mahogany, a beautiful, beautiful room with glass panels in it. This is the entranceway, and when you enter the entryway, you have just gone through the vestibule. The vestibule is a rather small area. The vestibule is wallpapered in silk, but it is not exactly wallpaper, it is upholstery. So we see that silk carried on into what I would have called the living room of the house, which is the north end of that first floor. They never called it a living room, they had other names for it, but it was originally also upholstered in silk, but my understanding is that that's now been pretty much replaced, because silk, even if it gets a little bit damp, it tends to stain. And I think there may be still some of that upholstered silk in that little vestibule, but probably not in the rest of the house. Solid masonry walls, other than, of course, the steel beam construction. 17 rooms, 4.5 baths, and one of the more interesting shower stalls I'd ever seen. I thought it was unique, but it is not. And this was a shower stall. It was probably roughly 4 by 4, and when you entered it, you could see there were horizontal pipes which surrounded you, so that you walked in. There was one here, one lower one, in addition to the shower head, so that you had water coming at you from all different directions, nickel piping. And I thought it was unique, but apparently it is unusual but not unique, kind of neat. The windowsills in the living room, again, which I'm calling it, are made of marble, so quite an interesting place. This building stands next to the Kennard House, and at one time, the Ferguson family also owned the Kennard House, and when they owned it, Mrs. Ferguson actually ran a boarding house in it and supplied the meals to some of the boarders in the building next door. We don't think of the Fergusons really needing the money, so what Mrs. Ferguson was doing, I don't know, but she did run it as a boarding house. There was something else I was going to add about that, but it'll probably come back to me. The state of Nebraska purchased the house in 1973. When they bought it, there was a great discussion of what was to happen to the house. The senators, the congressmen, the Nebraska unicameral, a great portion of them wanted it torn down to build a gravel or floor, not a garage, but just a single stall or single floor garage, because there was no specific parking lot for the senators at that time. There was also an interest in saving the house, because as you can see, it's quite an interesting house. This looks at the staircase, by the way, and the staircase kind of goes around and is one piece of milled carpeting. So Mr. Ferguson spent no expense in building the house. There was originally a different chandelier in the house and is there now. A lot of the fixtures were removed by Robert Ferguson at that point in 1973, because his understanding was it was going to be torn down. So he took out everything he could. He couldn't get out the Philippine mahogany work in the dining room very easily, but he took everything he could. And you know, we find fault with it today, but nonetheless, he understood it was going to be torn down. Terry Carpenter was the primary proponent for making it a parking lot, but others wanted to save it. Ultimately, Bob Ferguson, for his mother, got a life tenancy in the house. In other words, she was allowed to stay in the house as long as she was alive. She had it figured out. she lived in the house until she was 102 years old. And at that point, she had outlived Terry Carpenter. So the house stayed as a house. But the question remained what to do with it. My idea was, well, make a governor's mansion out of it. Well, we just had a new governor's mansion. Well, I kind of like this house better than the new governor's mansion. So I said, well, make it a lieutenant governor's mansion and turn it into a sort of club, if you will, where the senators could have lunch and they could hold meetings and bring maybe out-of-town guests in that were visiting, whatever, something like that. And that was completely nixed because they said we could not have a house which some people feel is superior to the governor's mansion for the use of the lieutenant governor. So it's going to sit there. At that point in time, I was still allowed to give occasional tours of the house. They would give me a key and I could give tours of the house. Then the state fire marshal stepped in and put a complete end to that. He wanted to condemn the house because there was only one staircase up to the ballroom on top, which meant that if there was a fire, there would be no really a way out. So now the state has the added question of should we spend the money to build a fire tower and use the building, or would it simply be better to make a senator's parking out of it? Well, in the meantime, the Senate has gotten their own parking lot directly across the street to the north on the top of what was to be the State Historical Society building, which we'll see perhaps in our next session how it was begun and got up to about this far off the ground and then stopped. And they left it as a basement for storage for the State Historical Society. Ultimately, it'll be capped over and used as the parking lot that you see today there. So the department, last I knew, the Department of Environmental Trust and somebody else were the occupants of the house. And they're always out trying to get people to use it as a venue. So if you had a Christmas party or something like that, they'd love to have you rent it out. It's a great facility. You can see some of the things in the house, too, if you wander around, like the ballroom on the very top. Also in the basement is, as the Capitol building, had a unit vacuum cleaner. And that was a big steel box in the basement with a suction device on it. And as you went through the house and all of the mop boards, there'll be a brass sort of orifice coming out that you can stick a wand onto and vacuum that room and close it. All of the dirt and stuff that's collected goes into the basement in that huge metal container. My understanding is the Capitol building's vacuum system has never been used. And as far as I know, the one in the house had been used, but probably isn't anymore, probably not functional. So the house has some interesting things, including in the kitchen. When you go in there, you can look and see that there is an ice box, of course, 1903, in the kitchen. But if you then go out on the porch outside, you'll see that there is a door on the outside so that the iceman, when he cometh, he can put the ice inneth from the outside. He didn't have to go in the house. A lot of little things like that. This is the front entryway. This is Mr. Ferguson's study, which the best way to describe its location was under the staircase. And you would get through it by going to the east and turned a corner. That's where his study was. He was a very interesting guy. Oh, excuse me, I've looked ahead. This is actually the dining room. And this is his study. A very interesting guy. When I was in high school, this Mr. Ferguson came and talked to my Spanish club in Spanish and told us little chistes, which are little jokes in Spanish, which I understood a little bit of, not too much. Very interesting. And of course, the Fergusons ultimately divest themselves of Yankee Hill brick. It goes to the Murdoch Company, and I'm not even sure who owns it now, but Capitol Beach was sold to the Coppels, and everything, one by one, went off. When he was president of Beatrice Creamy, he was very unpopular. He wanted to keep the business as a business, and others wanted to sell it off as its parts. They also literally moved out from under him. They moved the headquarters of Beatrice Creamy to Chicago, but he stayed in Lincoln. So he didn't last too much longer than that. The house next door is equally interesting. This is the Yates House directly to the south. 744 South 16th, or the northeast corner of 16th and H Streets. When I was a kid and you drive by this house and didn't know it was there, it had become so overgrown with fitzers and shrubbery and trees that it literally had disappeared in there. It was built in 1891, not by Mr. Yates, but a man by the name of Eneas, A-E-N-E-A-S, Hurlbut. And Mr. Hurlbut, don't know too much about him, but he probably was into real estate at some level, but also he had a clothing store on P Street, directly across the street north from the what's now the Journal building. It would have been about where that bank is on the corner, the Hurlbut Clothing Company. As far as we know, Mr. Hurlbut never actually lived in the house. He may have briefly, we don't think so. He obtained 3 lots from the state of Nebraska to build it in 1891. And this has always been kind of curious to me because, of course, Mr. Gillespie's house must have occupied one of those lots. But at any rate, it's said that he acquired the 3 lots from the state of Nebraska to build the house. And the house was completed in 1893. 5,600 square feet, 5 fireplaces, a really pretty spectacular house. Mr. Yates was Charles E. Yates, who came from Plattsmouth with the Burlington and Missouri River Railroads as superintendent of Lines West Telegraphy. So it's a big job, obviously, at that time. And this Mr. Yates becomes, the family is still the Burnham Yates family. So we have 2 factions coming together. The Burnham family, which owned the city of Burnham, which is where Yankee Hill Brickyard is today, come together, and it is the Burnham Yates family. 1926, it became a sorority. I'm having a terrible time here, aren't I? Known as the Phi Mu sorority. 1927, the year that they moved in, they picked up the carriage house, which had set behind and slightly to the east on the alley behind the Yates house. They turned it, a quarter turn, and moved it next door to the Yates house and turned it into an individual dwelling. So it's still there. If you look at that house, it looks like it belongs there and it looks just like a house. But think of it turning and going back to the alley as the stable, if you will. So that's an interesting side. 1931, it became the Theta Chi fraternity. 1934, it became the Sigma Kappa sorority. Then in 1937, it was bought by a man by the name of Wenz Naylor, Knaller, who turned it into apartments. Purchased later by a lady by the name of Donna Culwell, who decided to restore the house, cut down all of the trees, all of the shrubberies, bushes, and everything else. Had a guy turn hundreds, thousands maybe, of spindles to put all of the spindle work back into the porch work. She also discovered that there was a fad, probably in the 20s, where houses, particularly which had fish scale shingles, were covered over with asbestos shingles. That was up to date, boy. I remember my grandmother finally insisted that their white clapboard house be covered in asbestos shingling, which I thought looked pretty austere, plain, and not very interesting. It's certainly not as interesting as the clapboarding underneath. Well, they covered all of the shingling work on the house, which proved to be a good deal because when they removed the asbestos shingles, Mrs. Culwell did, they discovered that underneath it had done a perfect job of preserving those fish scale shingles. And even if they had to be replaced, they knew exactly what the patterns were. So they were able to do that. I think it's her brother, Larry Brandt, was there working in the restoration. He lived there in the house for a while. And most recently, her attempts to make it into a bed and breakfast or a venue did not ever pay out economically, as far as we can tell. We did use it once for the bookstore and had a signing in there. Worked very nicely, and beautiful house. It was sold then and purchased by Bill Wood, the attorney, who turned it into, guess what? A sorority and a fraternity house. It's been one of each since then. The YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association. You remember back when we talked about the YPCA, which is the predecessor to the YMCA, and the YWCA, which is the Young People's Christian Association. But the YWCA in Lincoln spun off in 1886, and they had a fundraising event at the Opera House, which netted them $1,125. So they were able to then turn around and purchase this site in 1905. And build this building in 1909, which sits exactly where the present YWCA sits, directly east and adjacent to the Bennett Martin Public Library. This is the exterior of the building and the interior of the building. They tore it down then, built the present building in 1932, and to build the present building, they salvaged all the bricks from the building we just saw and used them again in the present building, and of course supplemented them with more bricks. 1971, They rededicated the building and added a fire tower to the northeast corner of the building. And the cost of the fire tower and renovations was $275,000. So like anything you do a little bit later on, it's way more than the building cost in the first place. They gave it a facelifting. This was one of the places that I ate while I was at the university. The YMCA Cafeteria was one of 2 restaurants in the city of Lincoln which had Duncan Hines approval. So they got to hang the Duncan Hines sign outside. The other restaurant in Lincoln which had the Duncan Hines approval wasn't even in Lincoln. It was the Lone Oak. They both survived that, and Duncan Hines would send people out every couple of 3 years to make sure that it continued on in the level that it was supposed to be. When I ate there, it was Mrs. Hulbert was the operator from Havelock, and she was a master of cafeteria work, because to make something like that pay, you always take leftover roast beef from Wednesday and made it into soup on Thursday. She was able to reuse everything she needed to. So I was able to eat very good home-cooked meals for 25 cents. That didn't include the drink or anything, but for less than 50 cents, I could get a very good lunch there. Well, Mrs. Hulbert passed away, and the cafeteria, which was, of course, used primarily by just citizens and people living downtown or working downtown, it sort of faded away. And the building ultimately will be sold in 2013 to WRK. They have turned it in, as far as I know, to apartments, maybe condominiums. I'm not sure exactly how it's gone. And they're still kind of fiddling with what to do with things like the swimming pool, which is where a lot of people in Lincoln learned to swim. So it was a very popular spot. One of my favorite houses in the city of Lincoln at the time it stood was A.J. Sawyer's house. Andrew Sawyer was the mayor of the city of Lincoln. His house was located at 17th and F Streets. Carpenter Gothic or Victorian, has a lot of names that you could affix to it. Another picture of the same house. It was one of my favorites because it really was an imposing Victorian stick house, if you will. However, in the late 1920s, along came a company called the Lancaster Hotel Group. And the Lancaster Hotel Group purchased the First Congregational Church and First Presbyterian Church, which were located on 13th Street, facing towards the east. They tore them both down, and they built the new First Presbyterian Church at 17th and F. This house, actually, where it sat, was more the parking lot on the north end of the building. So one of the places that they tore down a house for a parking lot. And whether the parking lot is better than the house is problematic in my mind. But at that point in time, Mr. Sawyer had passed away, and his wife was living in the house. And when she sold the house to the First Presbyterian Church, she knew that their plans were to tear it down. So it wasn't, spirited away from her and torn down. She then moved into the apartment houses, which were directly across the street from the Capitol building to the west, where the printing facility is now. I think they were called the Orlo Flats, if memory serves me. And they were also owned by A.J. Sawyer. She lived there until she passed away. The Orlo Flats, which were kind of almost Richardsonian maybe architecture, not very inspiring, red brick. They came down and the printing office went in there in its place. A.J. Sawyer had one other thing going for him. When he was mayor of the city of Lincoln, every year on January 1, he opened his home for a New Year's Day reception, and every single person in the city of Lincoln was invited. Pretty spectacular. I mentioned that to a previous mayor, just sort of in passing, and he promptly canceled Halloween. So the house did get away from us. This building is still standing. Matt and I know this building pretty well. 1910, there was a man who had just graduated from Cotner University in Bethany, Nebraska. His name was E.J. Cius, and he was what was called an itinerant Christian minister. By itinerant, I mean that he did not have a congregation very long. He started, for example, the Disciples of Christ, the Christian church that's on South Street at about 24th. Is that Southview? I'm not sure, Southview. He started that church. and then moved on. So Mr. Cius was moving around primarily as a Christian minister. But by 1910, he was pretty sure that automobiles were the thing of the future. So he opened and built this building called the Lincoln Auto and Tractor School. Just exactly what they taught, I suppose, was more like mechanics and repair, not how to drive a tractor or a car. In this building in 1922, Charles Lindbergh took some of his training, and he probably lived mostly in the YMCA, but the guys who took training there were kind of all over the place. 1922 is when he arrived. There was a period in there where I've looked at people who said, Charles Lindbergh stayed in our house. And that was about 30% of the houses in Lincoln at Charles Lindbergh. And one of them was out on Van Doren. And then I discovered there is a fair chance he did spend a night, at least in that house on 19th, 18th and Van Doren, because he flew out of the airfield, which ran north and south about a half a block west of 20th Street, which parallels Lincoln Country Club. So he did fly out of there. Maybe he did stay the night there. I don't know. But he like George Washington, just bedded down one night. Every day was here in a different house, it appears. By 1929, the airplane school had moved out to Lindbergh Field. Lindbergh Field will have its name changed to the Lincoln Municipal Airport because it turned out there was already a Lindbergh Field in California. And the Aeronautics Department does not smile on having two airports with the same name, so we had to give up ours. During World War II, they trained primarily in this building pilots and crew chiefs, and they did quarter them at the YMCA at that point in time. And the story was that they marched from the YMCA out to this building. So roughly 13th Street out to roughly 23rd, 24th, whatever that building is. Pretty good poke, good exercise for them. Unfortunately, Mr. Cius did an extremely good job of training pilots, crew chiefs, and mechanics during World War II, so that when the war was over, the market was just literally glutted. He was not the only one training them. There were a number of these private schools around the United States. But they glutted the market. These guys came back from the war and all wanted to be pilots, crew chiefs, and mechanics. And so he was forced to close the school after World War II, 1946, 1947. The building has had a lot of tenants since then. Primarily, Donley Medical had its wholesale building in there and had a fire upstairs, burned out the top floor. 7-Up was located in there for a time. The National Guard Armory was in the building for a time. And now the ground floor, at least, is partly storage and partly an antique mall. The upper floor, as far as I know, is completely empty because it has never had a separate method of heating it. And the only way it was heated was for the heat to rise. And the gentleman who has the antique mall said that they investigated whether they could use it, but it was too expensive to add a furnace for that building. So it still stands. Maybe one of my favorite buildings in the city of Lincoln, simply because it has such a very, very interesting story to tell. The building was originally 6 stories tall, built by brothers C.C. and Carlos Burr, B-U-R-R, attorneys and builders. People who had their office in this building included Charles Dawes, later Vice President of the United States, and William Jennings Bryan. Harris Laboratories got an early start in this building as well. Lots of people started in this building. The Security Mutual Insurance Company started in Fremont, Nebraska in 1895. It started before that, but in 1895 a Lincoln group purchased it and brought it to Lincoln. This building they then purchased, the Burr Block, which is on the northeast corner of 12th and O Streets. And it may not look familiar to you, although in some ways the building still stands, in other ways it doesn't, as we'll see in a second. So in 1906 they bought it, in 1910 they began considering what to do with the building, and they wanted to modernize it. They wanted to remove what they thought were ugly onion domes up on the top, and they also wanted to add 2 floors to the building. So it's a 6-floor building. They hired in 1916 architects Burlinghoff and Davis to add 2 floors to the building. The building was a wall-bearing building, according to Engineering News, October of 1916, which Matt Xeroxed off for me some little time ago. And then one of the most bizarre building projects in the city, I think, started. They decided that they would, in two separate sections, take the building down and rebuild it. But they didn't exactly tear it down. They started with the south half of the building, and you can see there's a rounded arch in the ground floor on the 12th Street side. That's roughly the middle point of the building. They're going to start with the part towards O Street, but they're not going to tear it down. What they're going to do is they're going to go interior to the building and take out everything so that you have left the stone walls. And in order to do this, one of the things they do is they build a 92-foot stiff-legged derrick, which they put on top of the building, so that they can go clear out to the alleyway and bring up steel, which is brought into the alley. So think of I'm simplifying it, because it's not a simple process. But think of them as going into that building, taking out all the floors, and then slowly dropping the steel inside and building a steel framework inside the building, and adding 2 floors to the top. So the 6 floors become 8 floors. It's not really quite as easy as all that, but we'll see in a minute how they did it. And apparently they thought this was going to be economical. How they thought that, I don't know. But the idea was to move everybody from the south half into the north half of the building, do this thing, go in and more or less build from the ground up. And when they got down inside it, they realized the steel has to set on something. And there were no foundations for it. So they had a very elaborate poured concrete over steel and forcing through the basement to support the building. And they had to use the footprint of the existing building. They couldn't go out under the sidewalk, so very elaborate. They build sort of mattresses, which they'll put the steel on. They build the steel back up, reconfigure it so that in a way what was the 5th floor before probably isn't exactly where the 5th floor today would be. So when you say, well, let's go to the 5th floor where Brian had his office, you're not sure you can be there. It's not exactly true. They got all done with the front half of the building. First thing they did is, of course, they removed the steel onion domes from up on top. Now in this picture, we can see them working on the south half of the building, and I've got probably 15 or 20 pictures of this being done. Somebody took a lot of pictures. It's very well taken care of in terms of recording it. So here we are, adding the 2 floors. We can see the lower floors extant and the upper floor going on. And in this picture, we can see them working just on the very upper floors. And you'll notice that clearly in this picture, the north half of the building up to the alley is still there. Now, how they got people up and down, I'm not sure, but I'm guessing they must have left the elevators in the building at that point in time. And how the people that, how they did it mechanically, it seems like it must have been a terrible, terrible problem. Now we can see the south half, the front half of the building is literally finished. And we can see the north half of the building is just still standing there. After they did the first part, apparently they came to their senses in one regard. This going down inside the shell of the building wasn't the way to do it. So when they move everybody from the north half into the south half of the building, instead of recreating that rather bizarre enterprise, they decide to dismantle the north half, every stone, every brick, everything, and store it in 12th Street. We come into some pictures now which people have said, no, this is not what they did. But look at this picture and tell me, is the north half of the building there? No, it's gone. And some of the pictures show that 12th Street has literally become a stone yard. They've just taken all the stones and laid them down there. South half of the building, pretty much exactly as it looks today. Now we're going to go back, and we're going to start building up poured concrete and steel reinforced on the other half of the building, which must have been actually more economical, I would think, than the first half of the building, which seems bizarre and complicated beyond what's reasonable. They're going to complete the north half of the building, and here we see the building as it's completed and literally as we see the building today. Some changes have been made. When the building was capped off, one of the workmen poised himself up here on the extreme southeast corner of the cornice, which is actually about 4 feet over the building, beyond the building. And so I went up there and thought, I set up my camera and put my tripod and my timer and thought, I'm going to stand up there and recreate this. I got up there, looked over the edge and thought, I don't think so. Because it was just straight down. It should have been, if I'd have backed up, maybe I'd have gotten the job done, but couldn't do it. And of course, in this picture, we're looking towards the corner, and I'm sorry, but I must look at the screen because I wasn't sure whether you could see Walgreens or not. I didn't think Walgreens is in there. Walgreens is not in there in this picture, but Miller and Payne's building is, and we've talked about Miller and Payne's already, I think. So that's what we can see up there. Up on the floor, or top now, we have added a sort of a garden terrace. It's divided, the last I knew, into 2 parts, one for all of the tenants of the building, and the other part, just 1 or 2 tenants could use it, so gardens. And they've had some problems up there, but basically the same thing you'd have anytime you had a terrace on top of a building. There is a head house for the elevator now. Originally the building had in it, and I talked many, many years ago to a man who's long gone now. He was probably in his 80s or 90s, a dentist whose son had an office, and now he's retired, on the southwest corner of Sheridan Boulevard and 33rd. I can't think of his name. But his father had an office in the original building and told a story about how the original elevator was configured. It had no head house originally. It was a hydraulic elevator. Now, hydraulic elevator is in and of itself kind of an interesting feature, because if you remember the old automobile hoists where the car would go up on a steel cylinder, usually 12 or 14 inches in diameter, that's a hydraulic. And it's usually oil. In this case, this building was not oil hydraulics, it was water hydraulics. The other thing you got to realize is that if you're going to have a plunger or a cone go from the ground floor up 1 floor, you have to have a hole in the ground 1 floor deep. And if you've got a 6-story building, what does that mean? To me, it means you've got to have a 6-story drilled hole in the ground for this cylinder to be in when the elevator cage is on the ground floor, right? Or if it goes to the basement, you have to have a floor below that. And this dentist told me that when he was a kid, he remembered clearly, or not a kid, but an early dentist, that a woman came into his office completely drenched. That somehow the water had exploded up into the car and had completely drenched her. So replacing that would certainly have been an advantage. I don't know exactly how they do tall hydraulic elevators now, but I'm assuming they must have something like the old tin cup that I had in Boy Scouts that had little things in it, opened up. I don't know exactly how they do it. The tallest hydraulic elevator I know of around here is in Love Library. There may be taller ones than that. I don't know, but they're
County buildings has hydraulics.
City County does. Okay, thank you. And they're very smooth, and they're pretty reliable. However, I believe Lowell and I have been trapped in that elevator in the County City building, so it does have disadvantages.
They tend to limit hydraulics today to 5 or 6 floors max.
Okay.
Maybe 3 or 4 floors.
The answer to the unasked question was 5 or 6 stories is pretty much the total. And the answer came from the back that the County City building has, and that's what, 3 or 4 stories, right? 4, okay, yeah. So that's about the maximum. Interesting. And of course, those hydraulics are not water. Now, what became of that elevator? Well, the elevator cage, the story goes, and I've not been able to confirm or deny this story, but it had frosted glass cages. And those cages were purchased, anyway, ended up supposedly with the Smithsonian. But did they? I don't know. Maybe somebody will come up with the answer to that. I don't know. But apparently quite interesting. The early cages are there and covered with metal and wood. So you're not in that early part. You now have a head house with wheels on top. Well, the building, 1947, the Veterans Administration leased it. It was known as the Anderson Building for quite a while. The Security Mutual building, they moved into the terminal building, until they were building their new building on Centennial Mall. the Centennial Mall building is now the journalism school. So tick, 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 tick. They're going to keep merging and moving and going out to 27th Street and ultimately become part of Assurity with the brand new building there on the creek downtown. The Anderson building was owned by Victor Anderson, governor of the state, and J. Philip Mahoney in 1959. 1985-86, Centerstone took it over and began the restorations that are intact to this day. 1994, Security Mutual, now long gone, but was one of 31 insurance companies in the United States, were over 100 years old, and at that point in time, 94, doesn't seem so long ago, but it's a long time ago, they had $5 billion worth of insurance in force. So they have come a long ways and still are very large, as surety. That takes us to where we probably have enough time to complete the last one, and we'll start next time with the HP Law Wholesale Grocery Company. Now we'll entertain any questions you might have. I always like to say we have time now for questions, but not enough time for corrections. Okay? Yes?
Are there any pictures of that Anderson building going up in 1959?
This is the Anderson building. The building that's there was just renamed when the Andersons bought it. The thing that I found interesting was when Vic Anderson bought it, his son, Roger, the question was, are there any pictures of the Anderson building? Well, it still stands. It's just got its name changed all the time through the years. So we're looking at that original building with the additional 2 floors. Roger Anderson had a summertime job. One of the things they did was they put in a chilled air system to cool the building. And they had to drill holes for these pipes on both sides, in both the south and the north sections. And when they started building or drilling in the north section, he said some of the floors were poured concrete 24 inches thick. Now, how or why, I don't know.
This building,
Yes.
he was probably drilling through some of those mats of reinforcement that supported the steel.
Okay, Bob was saying maybe they were drilling through some of the mats that were holding the steel up. I don't know, but this would have been in the north half of the building, which was steel and concrete, as near as I could look at those pictures. I don't know, a lot. And the other thing is that when the Anderson building was rebuilt, they did it on a cost-plus basis. The other thing that I had written down that I didn't mention before was that first part of the building to rebuild it was $468,000. So that's a sizable amount of money at that point in time. But certainly one of the more interesting buildings in Lincoln, to my way of thinking. The Capitol building has some great whiskers, and we'll be getting to that in a couple of months. And I'm already going to warn Bob that I'd like to have you kind of do a dog and pony show with me on that. And obviously, we could, when we get there, we could probably do one or more programs just on the Capitol building. But I think we'll keep it simple and down to 1 hour at that point in time. That's coming up in a couple of sessions from now. And if anybody's interested, I have those 2 pages that Matt Xeroxed for me of the description of rebuilding the building. You can take a look at them up here afterwards. I found it fascinating and bewildering at the same time. Thank you.